After Democrats vote down a bill to fund the Department of Homeland Security, including immigration enforcement, Congress leaves town, setting up another partial government shutdown. Meantime, President Trump's border czar Tom Homan says the surge in Minneapolis is coming to an end.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the Journal's op-ed pages, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Colin Levy. The deadline to fund the federal government is officially Friday at midnight, but Congress skedaddled on Thursday, including to the Munich Security Conference, after Democrats blocked a funding bill that didn't include their desired changes to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. And resignation about shutdown seems to be in the air, but for how long, who knows? Let's start with Senate Majority Leader Republican John Thune explaining his view of these negotiations.
Tom Homan again announced this morning that they're pulling all of the ICE agents out of Minnesota. So that was something the Democrats had requested. But then the bill they voted against today, which was negotiated with them, it was a bipartisan bill, had reforms in it. It had body cameras in it, had de-escalation training in it. It had more oversight of ICE activities in it. These were reforms that the Democrats had requested, agreed to, and then walked away from. They said, we need more. We need more, and we need more in legislative text. We just don't need commitments from the administration. So the White House has sat down with them over the past several days. And, they wanted a 2-week extension, continuing resolution, to fund the government to allow for these negotiations. We said at the time it's going to take a lot longer. Let's do 4 or 6 weeks. They insisted on 2. Took them 10 days to even produce their first proposal. The White House countered that in 48 hours, but we're up against the 2-week deadline, and they didn't want to extend it. So again, I think they want the political issue here, Martha.
Kim, what's your sense of how this debate is shaping up in Congress, what the way out might be, and how much pain the public might have to go through to get there?
I mean, John Thune gave an excellent summary there of what had just happened. And I think most importantly, by pointing out that the big test, the big question that came up this week as we neared this deadline was, do Democrats want the issue, or do they want some actual progress? And now it's pretty clear they want the issue. How do we know that? I mean, they demanded, as he said, that DHS be carved out of the broader government funding bill. And happiness for small mercies. I guess the good news is that the rest of the government is not being held hostage as it was to the last Democratic shutdown. So it's just DHS. They asked for a 2-week extension so that they could work with the administration on some changes and reforms. I don't think that there's any way that you can look at the actions of the administration over those 2 weeks and not see an outstretched hand, an attempt to actually find some sort of an accommodation here. Not only are they shutting down operations in Minneapolis, they obviously have de-escalated there. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem said she was immediately rolling out body cameras to those officers, and that those would follow to other officers around the country in short time as the funding was made available to do that. And the administration has been trading proposals with Democrats. So the question is, if you believe the administration's operating in good faith, and the problem is that you just simply haven't had enough time to get to a final solution, you agree to fund to DHS for another couple of weeks while you get to that solution. And instead, the Democrats said, nope, we're shutting it all down. You haven't given us everything we want. And, it's been an opportunity for them to stand up and give the whole litany of speeches again and get DHS out of everywhere. And essentially what they're asking for too, Kyle, is a complete cessation of operations in terms of deportations by ICE and Border Patrol across the country. And while the administration is I think, very open to having more discussions about where they are and how they operate while they're there, the notion that any administration would allow a Democratic Congress to tie their hands entirely in terms of any deportation activity in the country is kind of lunatic, and it gives a sense of what Democrats are demanding as a price of this.
That's my view too. Is one of the unanswered questions, Colin, is what Democrats think that their base and their very excited progressive voters right now will allow them to accept as some kind of deal. The proposal that is at least publicly on offer from House Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Senator Chuck Schumer includes 10 bullet points and very sweeping ones, not only body cameras, but protecting sensitive locations, prohibiting ICE enforcement near sensitive locations, including medical facilities, schools, churches, and maybe there's some kind of agreement about churches or something that you could imagine. But courts, again, ICE likes to do some kind of enforcement in courthouses because people have already gone through courthouse security. So that is a public place, a public building where they know people they encounter are not going to be armed. Other bullet points here, no masks, requiring ID. And then there are others where you can imagine some kind of agreement about increased training, about use of force standards and whatnot. But Colin, as often happens with these kinds of shutdowns, a part of the challenge is that both sides, I think, feel like they are on strong political ground. And so they don't really at the moment seem like they are feeling much pressure or incentive to give.
Yeah, I think Democrats' demands and the way they've been negotiating does reveal that they really just want the issue. And as you say, some of the angles that they're talking about are better or more reasonable than others. Asking for targeted enforcement with judicial warrants, which is the standard that's expected of state or local law enforcement for basic operations, is one that people can have a debate about. Other things they're asking for are really intended to create a fight, like asking for agents to wear no masks and display ID. That's a tricky one because I don't think anyone likes the specter of masked federal agents arresting people. And I think there's a reasonable argument that law enforcement should be identifiable in the event citizens need to address misconduct. At the same time, this is a really touchy issue with a lot of agents who, are feeling that they could be directly targeted. This doxing question. In all of these cases, I think these questions of openness and how these protests are handled are these sort of touchstones of democracy and the way the agents act. Especially in the context of any use of force. But the mask one in particular also creates a bit of a weird dichotomy with progressives who have defended protesters wearing masks and covering their faces on college campuses, while harassing fellow students. So, I think all of that can really just, whichever side of the political argument you're on at the time, just sort of depends on your politics. But look, compromise is hard because if the Democrats vote for anything, they're going to get mowed down for supporting ICE. If any of the Republicans, are going to get wrecked for doing anything to control ICE. So, it's politically, I think, a more difficult moment than is ideal.
Kim, what's your sense of how the shutdown pressure will build as it goes on? Because this is a partial government shutdown of just the provisions of government funded by this Homeland Security bill. So unlike the weeks-long government shutdown last year, one of the big stories there was the air traffic controllers. The air traffic controllers are not part of this bill. So the one thing that is public-facing that is jumping out to me is the Transportation Security Administration is under Homeland Security. So the TSA director here is now saying this week that about 95% of TSA employees are deemed essential, must continue working and protecting the traveling public. There are about 61,000 of them. But also arguing that many of these officers are working paycheck to paycheck. And if they are not getting paid, you may have some of them call out of work, which was the story, again, with the air traffic controllers last year. And maybe that will be an incentive for Congress not to let this go on too long. On the other hand, I think there were a lot of people, including me, who were surprised at how long last year's shutdown ran.
Well, a bit of the joke of this shutdown that Democrats are demanding, they want to talk all the time about DHS and ICE and border security. ICE and border security will not be affected by this shutdown. Why? Because Republicans in the last reconciliation bill dumped hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in there for them to continue their operations. It was a boost in their money. And that money is simply there available for the administration to throw at it. And I do wonder if Democrats aren't going to get themselves a bit sideways. It's an old adage in Washington, don't oversell what you are doing. And Democrats are out there leaving the impression with a lot of these progressive supporters of theirs that somehow by shutting down DHS, they're going to be shutting down ICE operations. That's not going to happen. What is going to happen are these other elements that DHS funds. One of them, like you said, is TSA, not air traffic control, but TSA. And I would just note that it's great that airlines are still going to be running on time, but if you cannot get to your airplane in time because the security lines are 5 hours long because there are TSA agents who have not come into work, that's not going to really help you very much. So if this goes on for too long, yes, there will be TSA agents who call in and stick out. And that was always the issue with air traffic control. It wasn't that they were told not to come into work. They were. It's just that after a while, when you're not getting paid, you have more and more incentive to say that you can't make it in that day. And I don't know how long it'll take for that to happen, but if history is any guide, it usually begins to really ramp it up within a couple of weeks. The Coast Guard is also part of this. They'll still obviously be tasked with doing essential rescue operations, etc. But to the extent that there are other duties they perform, that's going to end. And then FEMA is another one, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I don't think I need to remind anyone who lives on the East Coast, there was just a giant storm over there. FEMA was engaged in some of the aftermath of that and trying to help some communities that have been particularly hard hit and that were not prepared for that cold. They're still dealing with questions from recent hurricane season. And so those operations will largely end as well too. There's going to be a lot for Democrats to answer for if this goes on too long. Now, they're going to claim that it's the Republicans' fault and that, if the GOP just did what it wanted, it's a mirror image of the bigger shutdown we had earlier. It'll be in more discrete pockets where there's pain. There's going to be a lot of finger pointing, but I think this one's a harder one for them to lay off on Republicans because it's so very clear that the administration has been willing to work with them in some capacity and they've been unwilling to work at all.
The Trump administration, in advance of this shutdown, also taking steps to de-escalate the conflict point between Republicans and Democrats over immigration enforcement in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Let's listen to Border Czar Tom Homan announcing that on Thursday.
In success that has been made arresting public safety threats and other priorities since this surge operation began, as well as the unprecedented levels of coordination we have obtained from state officials and local law enforcement, I have proposed, and President Trump has concurred, that this surge operation conclude. A significant drawdown has already been underway this week and will continue through the next week. We have a lot of work to do across this country to remove public safety risk who shouldn't even be in this country, and to deliver on President Trump's promise for strong border security and mass deportation. Law enforcement officers drawn down from this surge operation will either return to their duty stations or be assigned elsewhere to achieve just that.
Homan also said that the operation has been a success, and he's argued that the federal government, is getting more cooperation from state and local law enforcement. Colin, maybe that is true. I wouldn't be surprised if that's true. But the one person that I have been watching throughout this argument is the Minneapolis sheriff, the Hennepin County Sheriff, Dewana Witt. And as of last reporting in the Star Tribune, she is still saying, our office does not conduct civil immigration enforcement and our policies remain unchanged. The mission of the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office remains unchanged to keep the peace and protect public safety. And Colin, that is remarkable to me in part because she has now spoken with several reporters and had a bit of a public argument about should I or shouldn't I. There was a story about a week ago where she was pretty candid. She said, I'm well aware that if I make the decision to notify, it could hurt my chances of being reelected, but at least I could look at myself and say that I did what I thought was right to keep the people safe. unquote. And again, that was about a week ago. And as of now, she is still saying that she is not notifying ICE. And so I don't know. I mean, maybe there's multiple interpretations of why the Trump administration is pulling back from Minneapolis here, and maybe some truth in many of them.
I mean, look, I think this is a moment where local officials are just sort of getting a chance to stir the pot a little bit. I don't know. I mean, I think overall, as we're looking at this, it's best to come at it from what the administration is saying. And I think Tom Homan really has been a stabilizing influence here. I thought it was good that he was trying to acknowledge the cooperation of state and local law enforcement, or state and local officials. It was the right time to end the surge, I think, and it was clear that nothing good was going to come from further confrontations or escalation, between the administration and the protesters in Minneapolis. And I think Homan is walking a careful line with the MAGA base and the retreat. He made an effort to say recently, talking in an interview, that it's not like ICE is going to disappear entirely. He said something about how there's still going to be more than 800 flights a day into Minnesota, and if we really need to come back, we will. That may sound like a return to threatening talk, but I think in this case, it's really just a way to say, okay, everybody, we're backing out of here, but just hold on to your suspenders. We're doing this in a rational way, and we plan to keep an eye on things. And I think, given the way that things have been going, just from escalation to escalation over the past 3 or 4 months, that's an improvement and a calming influence, I think.
But Kim, whatever Homan might say about the increased cooperation, I find it hard to interpret this as anything but a recognition by the Trump administration that they have a political problem here, that there is a sense among many voters, independents who are voting in these special elections in state Senate seats where there is a huge swing away from the Republican Party, that things have gotten carried away. We had a listener, Rob, who sent in a story from this week by the Associated Press. Here's the top of it. An immigration judge has dismissed the deportation case against a landscaper arrested in Southern California last year, and the father of 3 U.S. Marines is now on a path toward legal permanent residency. Apparently, he came to the U.S. in the 1990s, does not have legal status. Also, this is a notable line in the story. The Department of Homeland Security said Thursday it would appeal the judge's decision. And so, Kim, I mean, I'm reading this. I get that there's negotiations in Congress going on. Maybe the pullback from Minneapolis is in part an effort to be responsive to that and make sure we can get funding for the Homeland Security Department, the TSA, the Coast Guard, and all those other agencies. Though it does also seem to me like a more broad shift, Tom Homan taking a different approach than the Trump administration took, at least in a large part of last year.
There's a really old saying in Washington, and sometimes we repeat it in our editorials, which is good policy equals good politics. And if you look at the Trump administration's stated policy objective when it comes to deportations, it's pretty good policy in that its argument was that this was targeted enforcement, that they were going after people that were clear and present public safety dangers, not folks that had been living here for 15 years and had never committed a crime, but that they were going after again, these are by their own words, they're going after the criminals. They were going after the rapists and the murderers and the people that are engaged in theft and Deweys and, drunken drivers and people that have been a menace in public communities. That is extremely popular among Americans. That is something that very few Americans have a disagreement with. And to the extent that that has happened, they did not have a problem. What ended up becoming the problem is that you had all these stories about Minneapolis fraud and the Somali community, the immigrant community there. And some of the more political characters within this administration thought, aha, this is a moment to really make headlines out of this. And we're going to send in the National Guard and we're going to do this surge in Minneapolis, a blue city that was primed to have a lot of residents that resented this. And we're going to protest it, and this problem was going to happen. This clash was inevitable, especially as it became clear that this surge, in order to kind of have enough work to do, they were going to start going after people that were not part of that targeted enforcement. And Homan has acknowledged as much. He was sent in to course correct, to put the administration back on that path of more targeted enforcement actions. He did ask for the cooperation of locals. I agree that it's still unclear to the degree to which they are, but it seems to have been enough of a fig leaf that the administration could back themselves out of this. Now, look, we know that this generally, when it's working in a targeted fashion, it seems to be more productive. It certainly is working in certain red states where there is more cooperation between, and it does seem to remain more targeted. I think this is a little lesson for the Trump administration and how you take a very good issue and you potentially start to wreck it for yourself. And that's how I read the drawdown and the kind of walk back from Minneapolis.
Just to provide a bigger sense of the polling here, remarkably, Colin, 3 polls in recent days where voters are saying that they now think President Biden did a better job than President Trump is doing. This is the Harvard-Harris poll. 51% of registered voters say Trump is doing a worse job. Rasmussen reports 48% of likely voters say Biden did a better job as president, 40% choosing Trump. Similar results from YouGov and The Economist. And my theory of the case here, Colin, is that the problem we're identifying in immigration is a problem more broadly in the administration's efforts here. So the on-again, off-again tariffs, the story this week that there was a criminal charges that were attempted to be brought against those Democratic members of Congress who made a video last year urging members of the military not to obey illegal orders. A grand jury apparently declined to approve those charges. The story this week that there's a bridge in Detroit between the United States and Canada that is almost through completion, is almost done being constructed, it's supposed to open later this year, would be a real boon for the North American economy, I think, given the bottlenecks on the crossings that currently exist, the Ambassador Bridge and then the tunnel under the river there from Detroit to Ontario. President Trump gets a bee in his bonnet on Monday, says, I will not allow this bridge to open. A mix of grievances against Canada, some that look legitimate to me, at least, complaints about their dairy protectionism, for example, and then suggesting that Canada is going to get into a trade deal with China, and China is going to eliminate the Stanley Cup. I know President Trump loves to wake up in the morning and stir the pot and try to get a headline and try to change the story that the media is focused on at any given moment. But my theory of the case is that many voters, it seems, wish he wouldn't, wish that they could go a week or two without seeing some new controversy coming out of Washington from the Trump administration.
For sure. I mean, Trump polling is definitely a function of that kind of chaos theory, as you say. I think people are hitting a point of exhaustion about it. People in the news business as well, probably. But immigration is also a part of that. I think it's been a big part of that because every day you wake up, there's some kind of new immigration story. And, the fact that Trump is polling lower than Biden in some of those polls was really something, because I don't think very many people are very nostalgic for Biden's presidency.
Or his immigration policy.
Or his immigration policy. I mean, no question that was, the disasters that were created there, really with, especially with so much abuse of the asylum policy and all of the illegality that really got us to the point where we are now. I don't think that's lost on voters. And I also don't think that very many Democrats are trying to reassociate themselves with that. Even Biden administration staffers who are running for Congress or governor haven't really been embracing the Biden brand. I think that would include, former Health and Human Services Secretary Xavier Becerra or Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who's now running for governor in New Mexico. And neither of them have put their connections to the Biden administration front and center. And I think a lot of Democrats, they still see his tenure as a real liability. But as for Trump, it's very clear that the shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy created a shift in public opinion, and that's borne out in the polls. And the NBC poll this week that said that 49% of people really disapprove of his handling of border security. I mean, that's a huge jump up from around 34% in April. And that's important because that margin has everything to do with breaking through the partisan divide. There's no question that Trump still has the support of the MAGA base, but you're starting to see moderate Republicans and independents really change their minds about the wisdom of this.
Thank you, Colin and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.